Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephanie Parrish. I am the Associate Director of Programs in our Department of Learning and Community Partnerships here at the museum. And it's my pleasure to see so many of you on the last day of Paris 1900, and also the final talk in our Lehman Foundation speaker series. Before I begin and introduce Lisa, I'd like to take a moment to pause and recognize the ancestral lands of the indigenous peoples on which the Portland Art Museum now stands. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, settlement, resistance, and resilience that bring us together. And join us in uncovering and acknowledging these truths at any and all public events. Portland, Oregon lies within the traditional homelands of the Multnomah, Oregon City Tumwater, Watlala, Clackamas Chinook, and Tualatin Kayapua peoples, who were relocated to the Grand Ronde Reservation under the ratified Kayapua etc. 1855 treaty, also known as the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855. Today, these tribes are a part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, and the Grand Ronde people continue to maintain a connection to their ancestral homelands and maintain their traditional cultural practices. I'd like to thank the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, the Native Arts and Culture Foundation, and the museum's own Native Art Advisory Group that helped craft this land acknowledgement. Thank you. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Lisa Bleee, who is Associate Professor of History at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. When my colleague Mary Weaver Chapin and I were discussing the 4 lectures that we wanted to hold in this series, we thought it would be ideal to conclude with something that encourages all of us to think about our own backyard. Just as Paris and other European cities of the 19th century were partly defined by their World's Fairs, what did World's Fairs in the American context mean? And in particular, what did it look like here in Portland when in 1905, this city hosted the Lewis and Clark Centennial and American Pacific Exposition and Oriental Fair? That was its full title, commonly called the Lewis and Clark Fair. It didn't take long to find the work of Lisa Bleee, who earlier in her career had written on the fair and the legacies and its legacies for the Oregon Historical Quarterly. And she once called Portland home as an undergraduate history major at Lewis and Clark College. She went on to earn her Ph.D. in history from the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, and since 2009, she has taught at Wake Forest. Her research now extends way beyond Lewis and Clark and the fair. She teaches courses in the American West, Native American history, environmental thought, memory, and public history, and is the coordinator of the Cultural Heritage and Preservation Studies minor. Her research interests include American Indian and settler politics, historical narratives, and commemoration in the U.S. West. She's the author of Framing Chief Leschi, Narratives and the Politics of Historical Justice, and Monumental Mobility, the memory work of Massasoit. That was just published in 2019. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Lisa Bleee.
All right. Thank you, Stephanie, for that introduction. And I've also prepared a land acknowledgement, and it doesn't hurt to repeat, right? I'd like to recognize the Kalapuan and Chinookan-speaking peoples, particularly the Tualatin and Multnomah, on whose traditional territory we are gathering. They have lived in and around this basin for thousands of years, and we acknowledge them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. And thanks also to Stephanie Parrish and to Jaleesa Johnson for organizing my visit from North Carolina back to Portland. It's been really wonderful to be here, and I enjoyed my non-dairy vegan breakfast as well, gluten-free. All right, thank you all for coming. I'm really delighted to be here and to be speaking about World Fairs again in front of an interested audience. All right, so international expositions, or World's Fairs, started in their modern form with London's Crystal Palace in 1851. This was organized in part by Prince Albert And the Great Exhibition was intended to introduce Britain to the world as its industrial and cultural leader, really to outshine Paris. And it was a big deal. The organizers piled up art, technology, and colonial raw materials in the Central Avenue for the greatest impact, and it worked. Attendance was equal to about 1/3 of Britain's population at the time, and numerous cultural institutions and industrial research grants were established with the proceeds that are still in existence today. Since their modern inception, World's Fairs have introduced visitors to innovations, grand architecture, and Western narratives. We have this phenomenon to thank for the Eiffel Tower, the Space Needle, and the geodesic dome, also known as the biosphere or the buckyball. For popcorn, for cotton candy, for banana splits, but also for both the assassination of President William McKinley and the debut of the X-ray machine that would have saved his life if his doctors had known how to use it. Expositions are emblems of an era confident that technological innovation and national participation would bring about human progress and world peace. They also grew out of a particular moment in the development of ethnic nationalism and late imperialism and industrialization. They carry with them these elements and legacies from these foundations. World's Fairs, I will say, are just simply the very best subjects to study from numerous angles, right? From art, anthropology, music, dance, architecture, chemistry, biology, on and on. But for social and cultural historians, fairs are incredibly revealing. They offer self-conscious ruminations on the meaning of the past. When do people actually get together and talk about what they think the past means and then present it to the world? Right? They both reflected and they drove popular trends. Their study affords insights into America's cultural authorities, right? Those who planned and paid for the fairs, as well as the values and lives of regular people that traveled to attend these fairs in huge numbers. They are both products of their specific moment and an illustration of the endurance of dominant Western ideologies. So come with me as I kind of drill down into American World's Fairs of this era from 1876 to 1915, beginning of World War I. Then we'll look at Western fairs in particular, and then tour the Portland Fair. And then I want to offer some thoughts on the legacies of this exposition and open a conversation about its physical and cultural remains in the city. All right, so this is going to be a bit history heavy, so bear with me. Okay. Between 1876 and the beginning of World War I, American fairs made up about 1/3 of all international expositions. They attracted 100 million visitors. Fairs in this period celebrated American industrial achievements, and they brashly introduced the United States as a competitor, culturally, artistically, technologically, to all of the great nations of Europe. Right? So similar to the kind of competitive edge that the first Crystal Palace was trying to get over Paris. So just like those European fairs, American fairs endeavored to showcase and celebrate progress. But the first American fairs were planned in a period in which political and economic power was starting to be concentrated in the hands of a few, right, as we know as the Gilded Age. And this resulted in social inequalities at home and a search for resources and new markets abroad. American fairs took place in the midst of upheavals and were intended by their planners to stave off unrest at home and build national support for imperial policies abroad. So I've divided these fairs into two eras, mostly to show that something changed in 1898, right? These fairs became more imperial in their thrust. But we also have an enduring aspect of these fairs that kind of runs throughout this period from 1876 to 1915 or 16. And that is the racist notion of white supremacy was a feature of all of these fairs. So let me first start with that kind of first era of the Gilded Age or post-Reconstruction. The World's Columbian Expo of 1893, here pictured, it was an enormous undertaking, was the centerpiece and really the culmination of this period. And it announced to the world that the nation had been powerfully rebuilt after the Civil War. The overriding idea was of national unity. But the reality, kind of on the ground, didn't look that unified, right? We have labor unrest in the East. We've got a string of wars between the US Army and native nations in the Mountain West, and anti-Chinese pogroms along the Northwest coast. Federal control over Western territories was anything but secure in this period, and Reconstruction, which I'll remind you is the set of policies intended to end segregation after the Civil War, was only kept in place by military occupation of the South. So in order to create safe conditions for American businesses to grow, which was the primary kind of goal of the government in this period, something had to unite a nation long divided even after the Civil War ended. Part of the solution was political. A political compromise, ended Reconstruction in 1877, and Southern states very quickly instituted Jim Crow segregation, which secured white dominance over a disenfranchised, impoverished, and for a while largely immobilized African-American workforce. The federal government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 and then worked in tandem with Western states to deny citizenship, land ownership, and transfers of wealth to Chinese and other non-white peoples. They did this through inheritance laws, through marriage laws like miscegenation laws. And at the same time, federal Indian policy changed. So we have the end of treaty making in 1871, and that also began the policy of forcing Native people onto reservations that would then be administered by the federal government. All right, and I want to elaborate on this last bit before we to round out the historical context for these American fairs. In 1890, the 7th Cavalry of the US Army attacked and murdered hundreds of unarmed Lakota men, women, and children camped near Wounded Knee Creek. This event marked the final military suppression of Native nations. And once Native people had been quarantined onto reservations, the US Indian policy turned in full force toward assimilation. Native men were forced to farm, no matter whether the reservation land could support it, and Native women were stripped of their economic, political, and legal power and schooled in the domestic arts. Tribal land was then divided into individual plots called allotments and held in trust by the government. And the so-called excess, all of those allotments that were not then meted out to tribal members, were sold to American settlers. And this resulted in an enormous transfer of unceded Indian land into Americans' possession. So I just want to point out between 1865 and 1880, with the institution of the reservation policy, we can see this huge land loss. Indian land is represented with the black. And then from 1880 to 1990, that additional land loss is mostly attributed to this period of allotment at the turn of the century. Performances of Native culture, from clothing to dances to ceremonies, were strongly discouraged by federal agents on reservations, sometimes by withholding food rations. Children were forcibly taken from their families and educated in institutions far from their homes, where they endured physical punishments and other kinds of punishments for speaking their own languages. The cultural violence of the assimilationist policy, not to mention land dispossession, was presented by politicians as the humanitarian approach to the nation's defeated foes. Right? It was the alternative to mass killing. So, this was the political work, but what about the cultural work necessary to justify and support white supremacist structures and ideology in this country? And this is where World's Fairs come in. Historian David Blight argues that the nation healed the divisions of the Civil War through commemorative events and by recasting national memory. White veterans from both sides, they got together in these huge picnics and they shook hands and had these big photographic kind of opportunities. And they agreed that there were no losers or winners in the question over slavery. Commemorations to the lost cause, popularized the idea that the South had fought the war for noble reasons, thus erasing slavery from national consciousness, and African Americans as well, right? This new historical memory was premised on white citizenship only. So by 1915, the nation had achieved unity without freedom. World fairs do this cultural work of molding national memory, of recasting the past to support a national identity that excludes people of color. Certainly, fairs in this period supported the lost cause narrative and endorsed African American exclusions. Many fairs, including Portland's, featured an attraction called the Old Plantation, complete with happy slaves and a vaudeville show with black-faced minstrels. Fairs created a whitewashed version of history and prevented Americans, people of color, from representing themselves. At the 1876 Centennial Exposition, which was held in Philadelphia, the Smithsonian brought a number of ethnographic items, native ethnographic items, some of which were plundered from grave sites, for display in the government building like so many trophies. At the 1893 Columbian Exposition, Wild West reenactments reinforced kind of a savage warrior stereotype, and photo opportunities with Geronimo, a defeated Apache foe, sent the message that Native people were exotic curiosities. The US claimed the right to display Native people and their creations, sending the message that Native nations were under the guardianship of the government, incapable of telling their own stories. So the result, just like the creation of the lost cause narrative, was a story produced at World's Fairs of benevolent paternalism and the so-called disappearing Indian. This cultural belief held that progress was an unstoppable force, that Native people, whose traditional ways placed them in opposition to modernity, would naturally pass away under such a force. So we can see this in this souvenir program for the Lewis and Clark Exposition. This is quite a common motif here, where you see this in a lot of American art. A Native man on horseback, usually in a forest, looking from up above down at that city developing in the valley below. The message here is that these cities that represent progress, that represent modernity, the Native man is behind them and apart from them, right? So very clearly then, we have this story that unified white Americans in this sense that they were together in this progress, this story of progress, but it excluded Native people. All of the fairs between 1876 and World War I shared commonalities, and prominent among them were exhibits meant to persuade visitors that Anglo-Americans were a superior race. And this was the enduring feature of American fairs in this period. All right, and that switch. In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain and acquired a colonial empire that included the Philippine Islands, Guam, Puerto Rico, and a protectorate over Cuba, and Hawaii was also annexed the same year. US companies promptly exploited raw materials from these holdings and hoped to sell manufactured goods to new Pacific customers. As Robert Rydell, who writes about World's Fairs, points out, American fairs before World War I supported the proposition that the success of the industrial economy, as directed by white elites, was synonymous with national progress. After 1898, fairs made an effort, fair managers made an effort with the help of the federal government to display America's imperial acquisitions and show how American paternalism was going to benefit people who fell under its dominion. The intended message was that the US would take on the difficult and thankless so-called white man's burden, which is taken from Rudyard Kipling's poem, to uplift its new colonial wards. And so on the left here we have one of the first fairs after the Spanish-American War in 1899 in Omaha. Omaha actually had a redo. They had a fair in 1898 and in 1899. But they really doubled down on the imperial iconography in 1899. And I want to point out here that American empire was not a settled matter in this period either. Patriots in Cuba and the Philippines both organized armed resistance to US occupation after the Spanish-American War. And in the Philippines in particular, Americans fought a protracted and unpopular war into 1902. Has anyone heard of the Philippine-American War? So I see maybe 3 or 4 hands, right? It's not a well-known war. It was a nasty war, right? There were congressional investigations into massacres of villages. This is also investigations into the use of systematic torture, like waterboarding was perfected on Filipinos during this war. So there was also this rising tide of anti-imperialism. And I don't mean to suggest that that rising tide was all about sympathy with Filipinos, but there were a lot of questions about whether the United States should be imposing kind of its dominion over people that didn't want to be associated with the United States. The federal government sought to counter this movement by embracing World's Fairs and by apparently doubling down on imperial displays. The government sent representatives to the Philippines to collect artifacts and to start to create contracts for performers. Okay, and one final note about the historical context to kind of explain what you're seeing here on the right. Around the turn of the century, anthropology began to emerge as an academic discipline. And the exposition organizers asked for scholars, for anthropologists, for help in crafting what they hoped or intended to be entertaining but educational exhibits. Anthropologists of this era held to a theory of racial hierarchy based on cranial capacity. That is, they measured skulls and decided that those measurements were linked to intelligence and also to things like moral character. And their work, kind of not surprisingly, often supported the beliefs of social Darwinists that held that races progress along defined stages of development, starting with primitiveness and ending with civilization. So you can see that kind of progress depicted here from kind of the lowest to the highest, with Americo-European on top. And because these theories developed from a social science, from science, they should be observable, which were then perfectly adapted to the purposes of fair organizers. So in the 1904 St. Louis Exposition, there was an anthropology lab set up where psychologists did all kinds of measurements on skulls in front of a steady stream of fairgoers. And then those fairgoers would see the results of those measurements and would come away with the belief in Euro-American superiority based on what they believed to be state-of-the-art research methodologies. At the 1904 St. Louis Expo, the Philippine Reservation, as it was called, which does suggest that link, right, in Americans' minds between Native Americans and Filipinos. But this reservation included the villages of different ethnic groups and tribes intended to illustrate human development from the supposed lowest levels, represented here with a man described as Negrito, up to what was supposed to be the better class, or Christian Visayans, pictured here in St. Louis. Although the twin goals of education and entertainment certainly were at odds, and they created a great deal of controversy, such as when exhibit managers insisted that Igorot performers wear more clothing than they were accustomed to in order to protect female visitors' delicate sensibilities. The sensational reports of these problems, right, only increased the popular fascination with the Philippine exhibit. Okay, so now getting to Western fairs. The 1904 St. Louis Fair was a huge commercial success as far as these things go, right? It absolutely revitalized the city of St. Louis, and its exhibition and concession model was one that the West Coast fairs also followed in the following decade. So these Western fairs were also imperial theme parks, right? They contain the same colonial architecture, the same narratives of white superiority, and the same social Darwinist anthropological exhibits. But they also shared some unique characteristics just among West Coast fairs. They all celebrated an aspect of the Western expansionist past and linked that past to present and future imperial ambitions in the Pacific. They referenced things like the gold rush and the construction of the Panama Canal. This clearly illustrates how westward expansion is really a euphemism. The United States has long acted as a colonial power, as it supported the settlement of its citizens in others' homelands. As historian Frederick Jackson Turner wrote in 1901, quote, "Our colonial system did not begin with the Spanish War. The United States has had a colonial history and policy from the beginning of the Republic." So we'll keep that in mind as we go to the Portland Fair. Okay. The origins of the Portland Fair can probably be traced to 1893, which is when the country was experiencing a kind of prolonged economic slump. And the businessmen in Portland hoped that an exposition, especially after seeing the success of the Columbian Exposition, they hoped that a fair in Portland would change their fortunes. And they pretty quickly got the cultural and political elite on board as well. Harvey Scott, the editor of the Oregonian, very serious man up here in top left, and Henry Corbett, looking sprightly here on the bottom middle, owned a vast corporate empire. The two of them created an exposition corporation and then convinced Henry Goode, the head of the Portland General Electric Company, to serve as president when it opened. So we have, I guess, what else do you need for a turn-of-the-century World's Fair but marketing with the Oregonian, corporate sponsorship, and electrification. Right? And then let's take a look, too, at this board of directors page, and we can play this kind of fun game of what do they all have in common, right? So clearly, right, they're all men, all white. They seem to all represent the business or professional class, and many of them are sporting just fantastic facial hair. So I see some things in Portland don't change. They shared a lot of the same interests, right? And then they created three related goals for the Portland Fair. First, they wanted to attract immigrants, right? They wanted to build up the population of the city. They wanted to draw investments to spur development. And third, they wanted to position Portland as the most important city in the Northwest for culture, technology, and art. Mostly, they just wanted to outdo Seattle, right? Each of these goals also promised these elite men some other benefits as well, right? Because a fair would no doubt increase property values for landowners. The Oregon Historical Society determined the date, which would be the dry season of 1905, and the historical theme, which is the centennial of the Lewis and Clark Expedition, which had reached Oregon 100 years earlier, 1805 to 1806. The directors designed a seal, you need brand recognition, and also a motto, and I'll return to that motto in a minute. But next, the site had to be selected. There were proposals for sites in Sellwood and Hawthorne that were rejected in favor of the site that was chosen, which is kind of northwest of town in a place known as Gild's Lake. It was marshy. There was kind of the outline of a lake, but it often flooded. And here is the layout of the fair superimposed over a later street grid, but it's still kind of a dated street grid. So I've also grabbed Google Maps image right here. So what you're looking at on the bottom here is Thurman, and this is labeled St. Helens Boulevard, right? This is 29th, so we have 27th right here, and this is Northwest Thurman. Here you see that kind of joint, and then the road going at this angle, that's Nikolai Street today. So the heart of the World's Fair, which is, you can see on this northwest axis, is really about the Adidas employee store parking lot. It's the heart of it today. So once the site was chosen, then you have to kind of move off what was there, right? So we have a mill, a dairy, numerous, I think, Chinese tenant farmers, and the swamps were drained in order to create this very neat lake that would be the centerpiece of the Portland Fair. Okay, so now we have the site. Everything is in place, so we have this ticket, and this is from the Oregon Historical Society. I love that there's actually the picture of the ticket holder. I guess it's a season pass, so it was big money. Okay, so let's tour the fair, starting with opening day on June 1st, 1905. And on this entry ticket, we see the seal, here made enormous on the right. A contemporary trade journal described the design. Quote, Two buckskin-clad explorers, each with a powder horn and gun, have raised their hands in salutation. Between them moves Progress, a woman draped in the stars and stripes. So the subject is historical, but the design really reflects the fair's imperial moment. Lewis and Clark, the actual people, would have been savvy enough in 1805 to know that you go into new territory and meet new people with gifts and trade goods, not brandishing weapons. But this reflects this moment, right, this 1905 moment, and the popular but perhaps unstated belief that progress and expansion have always been accompanied by and made possible through the use of military power. Think of President Theodore Roosevelt's imperial foreign policy, that famous saying, right, speak softly and carry a big stick. And the allegorical figure of Progress, she's not just a muse, right, she's in motion. She's leading, or even maybe like pushing, the movement westward toward the setting sun. She wears the colors of the flag, thus becoming American as she carries the mantle of European empire westward. And I couldn't help when I saw this seal to think of John Gass's very famous painting, American Progress from 1872. And this seal is, or Progress in the seal is reminiscent of this painting, kind of right down to the long flowing blonde, like Teutonic locks, right? And just to point out a few things about this painting, which I assume many of you are familiar with, right? We have Progress draping this telegraph wire, holding a book that could be a Bible or a book, and she's bringing with her light, kind of the light of enlightenment, but also Christianity, right? And fleeing from her, we have native people and beasts, fleeing from Progress, right? So this was popular shorthand at the time. It suggested to viewers that technological advancement and enlightened education comes with American westward expansion, and this is what native people and beasts flee from. Native peoples are oppositional to progress, but white viewers could see themselves probably in these folks or in these folks, right? They could see themselves in this hopeful, westwardly mobile figures of Lewis and Clark. Okay, so once a visitor has used their pass or their ticket to enter the fair, they go from the ticket booth under this grand colonnade. And the colonnade had etched on the very top of it here the motto for the fair, which I've made huge here. Westward the course of empire takes its way. This is a line from a poem from philosopher George Berkeley, Irish philosopher George Berkeley, here put to the task of interpreting American expansion in the 19th century. This popular notion of America as a young and rising empire is illustrated also by this painting by Emanuel Leutze, with the title phrase. And again, this painting, we see the celebration of westward migration, this idealized moment where migrants have reached the Great Divide and they're looking further west at the ocean and the setting sun. Hero pioneers, Daniel Boone, let's see, let me orient myself. There's Daniel Boone right here, and William Clark point the way. You may notice here that there's the kind of conspicuous absence of Meriwether Lewis. He wasn't popularly associated with rugged wilderness taming, likely because he didn't go on to government appointments in Western territories like Clark and Boone did. We see here the construction of manifest destiny, a romantic recasting of colonial invasion. We have livestock here at the bottom, kind of throughout, for the beginning of modest farms. We have women and children, very prominent here, to serve as the foundations for a peaceful and civilized settlement. And then we have the central Madonna figure, Madonna with babe, right, to make it clear that the Christian God sanctioned it all. By 1905, the phrase, westward the course of empire takes its way, would have been popularly associated with these tropes, and the colonnade motto primed viewers to interpret what they would see in the fair through this lens. So like other fairs, the imperial thrust was not subtle. All right, so after passing under this colonnade here, sorry, I think green is stronger. After passing through the colonnade, visitors would enter the Pacific Court, and they would be struck pretty immediately by the theme of the architecture. They would notice that there's, we'll just say a thematic coherence, right? So the Oregon State Building, this one right here, was Greek Revival. The European Exhibits Building, right here, was a Spanish Renaissance theme with a mission-style entrance. The Oriental Building, right here, featured a Corinthian style with an American eagle perched on top. The Palace of Agriculture, which was just outside of that previous image, but we're still in the Pacific Court, looking into the Columbian Court and the Sunken Gardens. The Palace of Agriculture was topped with a Byzantine golden dome. So the only variant from this European Empire theme was the forestry building, which was a blended rustic log cabin with grand columns. And here you can see the inside, the goods that were displayed there were all logging and other raw materials that could be gathered from the forest. So given Portland's important role in lumber exports to Asia and the fair organizers' goal of attracting both consumers and investors, this building and its displayed contents still very much fit in. Okay, so now let's take in the landscape. The key design element, as you may have noticed from the kind of previous overlay, was this very strong northwest axis. So the idea was to pull visitors through the colonnade into the Pacific Court, down the Columbian Court and the Sunken Gardens, and then down this grand staircase where they would see Gilds Lake, right? And then the mountains on the horizon beyond. And the orientation of the buildings also called to mind the geography of American empire, with the machinery, electricity, and transportation building. That's this one right here. And the manufacturers, liberal arts, and varied industries building on the east. And then the Oregon building, Oriental Palace, and forestry building on the far west wing. Right, so this recreated the sense that civilization moved from east to west across the continent, and Asia was commercially linked to Oregon and its exports. Visitors would experience a landscaped, park-like setting created by John Olmsted of the Olmsted Brothers, whose most famous work is Central Park in New York City. And there are also curved paths with statuary. At night, the whole outline of the fair and the paths could be lit up with thousands of light bulbs, which was an enormous attraction at this time in 1905. You can see the kind of scale of the fair by looking across Gilds Lake. So there's the kind of mainland section, a bridge, and the government buildings on a peninsula in Gilds Lake. So this kind of park-like landscaping reflects the dominant notion of the time that the apex of civilization could be conveyed through a mastery of the land, a mastery over nature. Olmsted and other landscape architects of the time interpreted this mastery not in terms of mills or like railroad yards of an industrial sector, but rather examples of nature made ideal by man, right? So this is their idea of what nature should be ideally. One final note about the layout. The architecture shifted significantly from the hilltop European style. So here's the green. Here's the hilltop European style palaces to the lower level. This was kind of the carnival part of the fair where non-white performers could be found, right? So there's the kind of the different elevations, but also I blew up these different portions of this image to show, kind of juxtapose the different architecture. And I think the photographer and we got to catch a couple people fighting near the fair, near the trail, excuse me. What you get to see from photos, historic photos. Okay, so more on the rowdy trail in a moment. First, Let's listen in on the opening ceremony and consider the nice, long 19th century official title, the Lewis and Clark Centennial and American Pacific Exposition and Oriental Fair. Right, so the planners tried to fit in everything. They also told a celebratory story about the nation's past and current expansionist culture that drew lines of inclusion and exclusion. By marking the importance of the Lewis and Clark expedition, saying that this is the history that matters, right? This was the first government-sponsored mission beyond the nation's borders. The title celebrated U.S. expansion west at the expense of indigenous people. It provided a story of pioneer grit and the growth of American institutions in what became Oregon, but it's one that excluded Native people's histories, their contributions, and silenced their perspectives. And it goes on, right? In the opening invocation, Methodist Bishop David Moore claimed that it was through God's help that Lewis and Clark, this is a quote, penetrated the trackless wilderness, scaled the rugged mountains, subdued the roaming savages, defied the ravenous beasts, and laid down the foundations of American civilization. The indigenous people of the region were but another kind of natural feature of the landscape, impeding progress. Their very humanity questionable. In this title and speech, the clear message was that Native people were separate from and outside of American civilization, thus fostering a sense of unity among spectators. Okay, the American Pacific Exposition referenced the recent imperial endeavors with a whiff of entitlement. Ignoring the strong resistance to U.S. occupation in the Philippines, but also in Hawaii, the exposition title claimed the Pacific as part of American domination, right? It's the American Pacific. The Oriental Fair drew a commercial connection between Oregon and China, and this is kind of not unexpected. Lumber and flour exports from Oregon to China made up about a third of Oregon's export revenues at the time. But it's also borrowing an old European trope that held that civilization moves ever westward and would eventually wake the sleeping giant of millions of Chinese consumers. Vice President Charles Fairbanks was in attendance, and he offered his thoughts about this portion of the title on opening day as well. Quote, "The mighty Pacific is at your doors. It invites you to illimitable commerce beyond. Yonder is Hawaii, acquired for strategic purposes and demanded in the interest of expanding commerce. Lying in the waters of the Orient are the Philippines, which fell to us by inexorable logic of a humane and righteous war. Our foothold is steadily increasing, and it will be immeasurably enlarged to the advantage of the entire country." So the speech, fitting with to this moment in the nation's history, was based on the assumption that future prosperity would come from further expansion west. And there's a little bit of defensiveness too there, right? All right, so now that we've been oriented, let's explore the statuary that visitors experienced or encountered in the serious part of the fair, right, the top part. The outdoor sculptures were mostly smaller copies from previous fairs, such as Remington's Coming Through the Rye, right? His kind of famous work was first exhibited in the 1904 St. Louis Fair. We also see several works by Solon Borglum, the winner of the gold medal for sculpture at the 1904 St. Louis Fair. Borglum grew up in Nebraska, and he spent his early years on a ranch, and he became well known as a sculptor of Western themes, such as cowboys and Native Americans. And his work is depicted in the Indian Buffalo Dance and the Pioneer in a Storm, both of which were at St. Louis originally. And I want to focus on one of his statues in particular. So let's start at the ticket counter, right? Going through the colonnade into the Pacific Court after we've taken in the ceremony. Then you make a right on Lewis and Clark Boulevard and go into the Technologies and Varied Industries section of the fair, where you will encounter Solon Borglum's A Step Toward Civilization. This again was a smaller cast of the St. Louis original, and as you can see, I've tried to also find a smaller model to give a more clear image. As you can see, it's composed of several native figures, probably 4. There are those dressed in buffalo skins and holding a kind of rude wooden staff. here. Right, there's the staff, to indicate a stubborn reliance on the land, and they have this downward posture symbolizing exhaustion and extinction. And then those figures that are rising above these trappings of tradition and eagerly pointing toward a future point. And the central figure, he's dressed in wool fabric, no doubt manufactured in an Eastern textile mill, and he points the way toward civilization, the title announces, and therefore renewed energy. And this impression of growing energy and kind of forward motion is reinforced with this young boy here who seems ready to spring in the direction of assimilation. Surrounded by buildings exhibiting the latest American technology and varied industries, the message would have been very clear to visitors. Native people who clung to their traditions and failed to embrace American civilization were doomed to disappear. The statue suggested that it was deficiencies in Native ways of life that caused their decline, rather than the ravages of diseases, the loss of homelands, the violence of forced assimilation. Native Americans apparently had only themselves to blame. The figure of the young boy ready to heed the call of civilization, however, he looks forward to a bright future. And this was the very justification of boarding schools at the time. Remove children from the so-called polluting influences of their families when they're young in order to mold them into industrious, assimilated Americans. Okay, now I'd like to turn to one of the only original statues unveiled at the fair. It was also the first, this was amazing to me, the first public commemorative statue of an American woman to be unveiled in the United States, rather than an allegory or a generic mother figure. Sacagawea, and here I'm using the kind of Mandan pronunciation that I was taught at Lewis and Clark College. Sacagawea by Alice Cooper reflected renewed interest in the Shoshone woman at the turn of the century, thanks in large part to this historical novel by Eva Emery Dye. Eva Emery Dye was a Clackamas County chairwoman of the Oregon Equal Suffrage Association and leader of the Sacagawea statue fundraising drive as well. She was really instrumental in making Sacagawea a household name. What we know of Sacagawea, like so many women in the American past, comes from the little that men wrote of them. The journal writers on the Lewis and Clark expedition made only terse mention of Sacagawea, and later editors often referred to her by a derogatory term for an indigenous woman. Here's what we can glean from the journals. Sacagawea was taken captive by Hidatsa raiders from her Shoshone village in Idaho around the age of 12. She was then sold to a French trader named Toussaint Charbonneau as his second wife. The teenage girl joined the expedition, the Lewis and Clark expedition, when Lewis and Clark hired her French husband, Charbonneau, as an interpreter as they traveled west from Mandan and Hidatsa territory. It also seems as though Toussaint Charbonneau was also selected because of his cooking skills. He made some delectable sausage, buffalo sausage, that Meriwether Lewis could not live without. And so Sacagawea was probably chosen over the second wife, despite the fact that she had just given birth 2 months earlier to a son, probably because she retained her Shoshone language skills. So there is little question that on the expedition, she played a really valuable role as a translator in the upper Missouri River in the Shoshone-speaking territory. But realistically, she also knew neither the language nor the terrain in what became Oregon as the expedition went further west. She and her infant son, Jean-Baptiste, likely served as a symbol of peace with the expedition when they were encountering new groups, right? Because you would never have a woman and an infant on a raiding party. She collected wild foods that boosted the expedition's rations, and she was also really instrumental in saving some scientific instruments and writings, right, that were floating down the Missouri River in an accident. So she collected those valuable instruments. And she also, really importantly, convinced her brother, who would become Shoshone chief in her absence, to provide horses to the expedition for an overland portage. Dye's 1902 novel, The Conquest, took these bare facts, kind of paltry facts, and blended them with really imaginative fiction to paint Sacagawea as an American heroine and a key figure in the success of the expedition, all while caring for an infant. The conquest changed public perception of Sacagawea, and she would thereafter be depicted in statues, in novel covers, in many kind of public, popular representations, with her son on her back and actually pointing the way, appearing to kind of open the West. There were several notable figures that spoke at the unveiling of the statue. Susan B. Anthony, the kind of famous woman suffragist, described Sacagawea as part of a line of patriotic American women and credited the woman she called the brave little Indian mother for the foundation of Portland and Oregon, and thus urged the audience to remember patriotic American women and support women's suffrage in the next election, which they did not. Anthony credited Sacagawea with spreading U.S. settlement into the homelands of indigenous people, assuming patriotic intent when, of course, Sacagawea was not a citizen. The second speaker was a member of the Washington Improved Order of Red Men. If you're not familiar with the Improved Order of Red Men, this is a fraternal order that was limited to white men, and it's still around, and they organized themselves according to their interpretation of the League of the Iroquois. So this speaker credited Sacagawea with helping to transform what he called a wilderness into a commonwealth of great commercial enterprises. This reference to Sacagawea's supposed support for a capitalist order, which would exploit her people, and Northwest trade connections to Asia is again quite a stretch. But reflecting popular sentiment at the time, this meant Sacagawea was partly civilized because she recognized the value of American capitalism. Eva Emery Dye also used, she was the third speaker, also used Sacagawea's likeness to promote an idea of progress in her speech. And she went on to present a number of, I would say, like as a historian, cringe-worthy fallacies about Sacagawea. She described Sacagawea as a princess, completing a continental march of civilization that began when Pocahontas saved white men and directed them to the interior. By serving as a guide for white men from the interior to the West Coast, Sacagawea knowingly, quote, gave up the key to her country, sacrificing land to whites in order to, quote, open the way to a higher civilization. So by describing Sacagawea as a Native woman who realized the value of white male ambition and aided in their domination over others, Dye endowed Sacagawea with Western feminine values and moved her further down that line, right, from savagery to civilization. Dye plucked Sacagawea from her actual life, her culture, and her circumstances, and made her into a reflection of the values of the society that claimed the right to define her. The statue was both a symbol for feminism and national expansion. A journalist later wrote of the moment of the statue's unveiling that the sculptor had found that noble spark in Sacagawea, successfully uplifting her through art to stand above other Native people. So because Sacagawea's image has been used so often to narrate U.S. history and identity, she also holds the honor of having more statues commemorating her than any other American woman. Especially after the defeat of women's suffrage in the election of 1906 in Oregon, Sacagawea, the statue, which is now in Forest Park, has become an emblem of the pioneer mother. Okay, now that we're finished with the serious section, let's head to the trail. So this was the kind of avenue of concessions. It was supposed to be lighthearted fun. There were food vendors, slot machines, souvenir shops, performing horses, a fortune teller, and live performances meant to be seen as exotic, right? We have the Carnival of Venice, the streets of Cairo, a Japanese tea house. This was a big attraction, and it was a huge moneymaker. Live displays also gave fairgoers the chance to consider narratives of racial hierarchies and to learn about the nation's colonial subjects. Inspired by the Indian Congress at Omaha in 1899 and the Philippines Reservation at St. Louis in 1904, the Portland planners hoped for a huge Indian and Philippine exhibit populated with what they called numerous types. They were mainly motivated by profit, right? They wouldn't even kind of pretend that these live displays needed to be educational. In the end, they settled for contracts with a single Indian reservation and one Philippine tour group because they knew that even a small live display would be incredibly popular. I want to point out a couple things before moving on. The Alaska and Klondike concession, right here in the corner. Old Plantation appears right there across. Indian Collection is right here on the side. And infant incubators, which I always find interesting that they're in the entertainment section of fairs, but these are also a staple of American World's fairs. Okay, so you're oriented on the trail. The native performers and exhibits appeared throughout the fair and the trail, even though we have the Indian collection right here. There were several one-off events like athletic competitions, musical performances, and always opportunities for posed photographs. And all of these things were kind of demonstrating that Native people were bound to tradition, and especially when exhibited adjacent to but separate from the newest technology. They were also outside of modernity. On the trail, the Native people appeared in a concession called the Indian Collection. Here, families of Nez Perce and Umatilla men, women, and children lived in teepees and interacted with visitors. Even though normal Nez Perce and Umatilla life more closely resembled that of their non-Indian neighbors at the time, they were contracted to build teepees and wear clothing that communicated their difference and connection to the past. And to be clear, this was not allowed on their reservation home. Among the Native group of 25 were men who fought against the U.S. 30 years earlier, and including a man that the newspapers described as an old veteran who wears his enemies' scalp locks. Such sensational reports shaped visitors' expectations of what they saw. By linking this group with warfare, the representation reinforced stereotypes, kind of the warrior stereotype, while also justifying the violence of expansion into Native homelands. And by pointing out the advanced age and older style of home, all Native people would be considered primitive relics of the past. And ephemera available throughout the fair, right, but that depicted Native people, also reinforced these negative stereotypes of Native people and placed them in the past, right? 1805 is where we have Native people, 1905 is where we have the kind of frolicky fun. All right, newspaper and magazine stories also served to entice visitors to the live displays, especially to the Igorot village to observe the Filipino group. The exposition organizers contracted with a man named Richard Schneidewind, who brought over 18 men and 7 women from Bontoc, Takukan, and other villages in order to construct their homes at the Portland Fair. Schneidewind's contract with the performers provided monthly salaries of about $10 for the older members, and the younger members had lower salaries. Their transportation, their lodging, and their food was all included. Probably their contract was for about 2 years and included numerous fairs after the Portland Fair. And I think in this case, it also included language promising education while on the tour. And I'm happy to answer more questions about this particular group afterward. So this was a kind of pretty standard contract. The Igorot village opened only 6 weeks before the fair closed for a number of reasons, but the planners wasted no time in promoting it, describing the group as a curiosity, clad in G-strings, pagan, and barbarian. Like previous fairs, in Portland, the exposition pamphlets and local press described this Igorot group as a race who had not progressed up the path to civilization. And to illustrate this theory, the Igorots performed everyday tasks, such as eating or home maintenance, in front of a paying audience, primed to read these activities as exotic and primitive. Ceremonial feasts were a common feature of the concession and were based on the performers' supposed proclivity for eating dogs. Really, it was based on the 1904 exposition, the popularity of the dog feasts. The fair program claimed that, quote, all Igorots eat dog, as though it's a racial trait. Fun historical fact here, that's not included anywhere in the Portland Fair pamphlets is that Meriwether Lewis loved a good roasted puppy on the expedition. Didn't make it into the fair. In one photo, we see Igorot boys here on the left preparing the feast for a crowd of spectators. And they're really kind of close in, right, as they're inspecting this process. The scandalous nature of the feast reinforced visitors' assumptions about the relative progress of different races, perhaps convincing them of the need for American intervention to teach Filipinos proper manners. This was justification for the Philippine-American War, and suggested that the model of conquest and assimilation could be applied in Pacific colonies. Historian Emily Trafford wrote about the Portland Igorot village and said that it contributed to the globalized vision of white supremacy that drew on and extended domestic racial hierarchies. So this is exporting American racial hierarchies, or this ideology. And this exhibit, as the planners hoped, was wildly popular. And I read that it earned 3 gold medals, whatever that means. I think it was for audience popularity. Okay, so I want to pause our Portland Fair tour here for a moment and skip to the 1909 Seattle World's Fair, because I want to make a few quick points about live displays and how we can think about them today and research them. So I researched the Eskimo Village, which was part of the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition in Seattle in 1909. This was also a concession that was on the trail in Portland, right? I don't think it was at this scale, but you saw that there was the Alaska and Eskimo concession. And for this research, I looked at sensational newspaper stories and read them against the grain, or against the intention of the authors, to find the humanity in the participants. And I tried to interpret the actions of the participants through their own cultural frameworks. And what I found were many, many different stories, right? There were probably over 100 performers, likely 100 different stories. But in general, I found a group of seasoned performers from Labrador who brokered their own contracts. They were very well-versed in American fairs. And they, in English, often corrected fairgoers' misperceptions about Inuit people during their performances. I also learned about Inupiat reindeer herders brought down from Alaska who felt absolutely no obligation to entertain visitors and returned to their villages pretty much right away after the start of the exposition, which left the white manager to face the crowd's questions about the reindeer, which were only brought to Alaska rather recently as an American colonial venture in the first place. Totally interesting story. All right, and then we have also the Siberian Yupik village that contracted to bring over a group. The contract was really similar to the one that we saw for the Igorot Fair, the Igorot village in the Portland Fair. This Seattle Yupik group, they were interviewed by immigration officials and reported that they were satisfied with the work, with the pay, and they made jokes about the food. I learned that people coming to fairs on performance contracts ventured out of their respective villages and sometimes off the fairgrounds, and of course they made their own assessments of what they found. Some earned wages or prestige that they could then put to good use on their returns home. Some saw their travels in America as routine and unremarkable in the context of their lives, which always involved movement. Some felt wonder. Some felt homesick. Some became sick. Some died. By delving into their really diverse stories and cultures, even though they were presented as all the same in the Eskimo village, I was able to see how their travels to the fair fit into or didn't fit into their responsibilities and obligations to their kin at home. Their lives were bigger than the fair. So I have 2 main points. First, we need to be honest with the ways such human displays, premised on a power imbalance of one group observing the other, were exploitative. Second, historians and others delving into this past, we need to be creative and empathetic to reach into the silences in the colonial record. And what I mean by the colonial record or the Colonial Archive is those collections of writings created and then preserved to support the colonial project, which includes World's Fair ephemera at the Oregon Historical Society. So yes, such exhibits were exploitative, but the work could also have had meaning for the participants in the context of their own lives beyond this colonial framework. They could have felt pride, curiosity, wonder, joy. So let me be clear, right? Acknowledging this doesn't justify how they arrived and were treated. But restoring humanity to people displayed as objects means refusing to paint them as one-dimensional victims. Okay, and we'll return onto our Portland tour. So having moved through the trail, experiencing all those concessions, you move on the bridge across Lake Guild to the government building. So let's peek into the government building. Here, visitors would find displays of the natural resources acquired in the new Pacific holdings, right? You'd have examples of hardwood, like teak and rubber trees from the Philippines. You'd also see native people's crafts placed next to ethnographic items collected from the Philippines by the government for comparison. The Native Crafts exhibit was intended to highlight the benefits of the government's assimilation policies in particular. Okay, so the Native Craft exhibit was prepared by the superintendent of the Chemehuewa Indian School near Salem, Superintendent Edwin Chalcraft. And he divided the display into two cases, or two groups of cases. The first contained pre-reservation crafts, such as a canoe, moccasins, carrying bags. These were all craft work that Native people were encouraged to abandon. The second set of cases featured industrial works made by boarding school students, including blacksmith tools, buggy equipment, and tailoring. He reported, quote, "The greater part of the exhibit is devoted to industrial and literary training given pupils in the Indian schools and showing their ability to take up the pursuits of our own race." These display cases together, right, put next to one another, illustrated for visitors how Native people could advance under the government's tutelage. The cultural violence of assimilation, the psychological and emotional suffering of children taken from their families and institutionalized, all of it could be justified with the story of Native progress under American benevolent domination. It was a story that could be then told about the future of America's Pacific colonies. All right, the fair came to a close on October 15th, 1905, and is considered a success by usual fair measures. This was largely a privately funded fair from stockholders, and those stockholders received a really amazing return on their investment. It was also a turning point in Portland's cultural and economic development. I don't know much about the details, but I wonder how many of our cultural educational institutions benefited, right, from this growth from the World's Fair. And for a while, at least until the 1909 Seattle Fair, Portland could claim to be the biggest city in the Pacific Northwest. All right, since the buildings of the fair were not meant to last, we have very few physical remnants of this fair in the city today. There are a few surviving buildings. The Fairmont Hotel is in its original location, which was just outside of the fair gates. The American Inn, pictured here on the shore of Guilds Lake, which was then moved to 21st and Northrop and converted to condos, as you do in Portland. And the National Cash Register Building, which actually was originally at the 1904 St. Louis Fair and then moved to Portland and then moved to St. John's, which became then this McMiniman St. John's pub. Check it out, it's beautiful inside. It hosted mostly speeches and exhibits, like art exhibits. Finally, the Forestry Building was moved to Forest Park, but it burned to the ground in 1964. But what else remains? What are the historical narratives still embedded in this place? How do narratives of white superiority endure? What can and should be done? So I'd like to wrap up this talk by hopefully opening a conversation about the legacies of Portland's Imperial Fair. It always bears asking what kind of social injustice and exclusions, what kind of damaging narratives are we continuing to endorse with silence? Let's consider the oldest public art in the city, the Statue of Sacagawea that now stands in Forest Park. a likeness of a Shoshone woman that white men and women claimed the power to represent and interpret in 1905. But also think of team mascots. Also think of the generic tobacco store Indian wearing a Plains headdress. Have you seen these representations in the city? Across the country, cities are rethinking, or beginning to rethink, their public statuary and their artwork. The 2015 shooting at a black church in Charleston galvanized opposition to symbols and monuments to the Confederacy. And 2 years later, the 2017 white nationalist rally to protect the Confederate statues in Charlottesville shifted public sentiment yet further. These statues are not historical relics. They are arguments about the past cast in stone by elites who believed in white supremacy. The public has increasingly come to see statues and symbols as dynamic rather than inert, acknowledging that they can in fact energize racism and create a landscape that endorses inequality. Confederate statues are coming down all over, including in my now home of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. That statue came down over the summer with very little fanfare. When it comes to commemorations to the Confederacy, public sentiment seems to have shifted from contextualize it, put it in a museum, to just get rid of it. But what about commemorations to American colonialism and expansion? What about the history of indigenous peoples that many memorials actively work to dismiss or obscure? There are debates over Columbus statues in several US cities, but so far only Los Angeles has answered the call of protest and removed their statue to Columbus. Of course, an Indian statue is more complex than a memorial statue to Columbus. Sacagawea has been memorialized because she was believed to have served the interest of US expansion as a so-called pioneer mother, as you can see here on the plaque. But she has also been a feature in the oral traditions of several tribes, the Lemhi Shoshone, Wind River Shoshone, Comanche, and Hidatsa, and probably more, who all have different understandings of who she was and why she became important to the story of Lewis and Clark. The Lemhi Shoshone, for example, stress that the completion of the arduous expedition rested on a Shoshone teenager's cultural knowledge and courage in circumstances not of her choosing, right? This story contains an important lesson for Shoshone children. So Sacagawea is, to say the least, a complicated figure. And I want to, again, step away a bit from Portland and tell you about some of my research on a commemorative statue of Massasoit in Plymouth, Massachusetts, which may shed light on the complexity of an Indian ancestor celebrated by non-Indians. This is the statue of Massasoit. Massasoit, if that name isn't familiar to you, is famous for brokering a mutual defense agreement, what the English called a peace accord, with English colonists in 1621 that lasted for 50 years. Mayflower descendants and the Improved Order of Redmen honored him with a statue in 1921 for supposedly saving the colony and ensuring the foundations of the United States. Wampanoag people today honor their ancestral leader for making the best decisions he could under trying circumstances, right? The world was changing for the Wampanoag in 1621. But they also feel some ambivalence about the outcome of this decision, which opened the door to colonialism, English colonialism in the East. And in recognition of this complicated legacy, in 1970, the United American Indians of New England began meeting at the statue to march in protest through Plymouth on Thanksgiving Day. They also wrote and installed their own plaque near Massasoit. Sorry, I'll return to this image. This is their plaque and rock right next to the statue. And their plaque introduced the notion that the continent's indigenous people do not celebrate Thanksgiving, instead recognizing a national day of mourning. Their interpretation was based on the experiences of Native people after the Mayflower dropped anchor: devastating epidemics, genocidal violence, land loss, cultural oppression. My research follows the work of current Wampanoag public intellectuals who also seek to disrupt the peaceful colonization narrative surrounding Massasoit with a number of exhibits, third-person costumed interpretation, and walking tours. So, do such indigenous interventions make a difference, whether in the form of a plaque or other public history programs? Do they change viewers' minds? I asked passerby, such as these folks here, what they thought of the statue and the history that it conveyed. Often they looked at the statue and then down at the Day of Mourning plaque. People in Plymouth largely got it, right? They saw that different interpretations of the past could coexist, and they largely were sympathetic with the Day of Mourning. Tourists might flock to Plymouth to see a certain rock and hear a certain happy story about America's foundations, but they also had the opportunity, many opportunities, to learn a more complicated and complete history of America, and they were mostly grateful for it. And on a related note, I learned that some in the city have already started to bring attention to forms of racism hiding in plain sight. Mac McFarland, head of the Center for Contemporary Art at PNCA, who provided this photo via Stephanie Parrish, is lead on a grant to support Indigenous interventions into the chieftain heads built into the 1913 post office building, which is now part of the school's buildings in Portland. And this photograph shows the work of Sarah Systream, who may be in this audience. Okay, or may not. I talked to Mac before this, so I know only very little about this grant, but it promises to open people's eyes to what has been obvious all the time. All right, so in conclusion here, I don't mean to promote any specific action on the Sacagawea statue. I'm not encouraging everyone to go drag it down right now, or action on any other Indian iconography around the city. But I do hope that learning more about Portland's Imperial Fair in 1905 will prompt questions about the perspectives of those other than the elite white men who planned and promoted it. I hope to prompt consideration of how the fair peddled romantic notions of expansion, narratives of racial hierarchy, and objectified human bodies to spur this city's growth. I hope to encourage discussion about narratives of what it means to be American and even human, told and retold in commemorations, statues, and the built environment around us. Thank you for listening.
I know some of you must run out and check your parking meters, but Lisa, would you be willing to answer a few questions? All right, so we'll give you a moment. Anyone who needs to run, please feel free to do so, or if you need to get up and stretch your legs, that's allowed too. And I think both Stephanie and Jaleesa have microphones, and so once we get people kind of settled, they will we'll ask for hands to be raised, and we'll ask you to hold your question until you have a microphone in your hand, and that will help us help everyone hear the question and also for our recording. Thank you. Okay, it looks like
I have a question over here. Hang
okay,
on.
Stephanie's going to start. Thank
One
you.
second.
One small question. What you called the trail, would that have been called the Midway in other fairs?
Yes, exactly. That was the Midway
Okay.
interpretation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering how much tickets cost to the fair and whether they were low enough priced so that it was fair for all people to be able to come to the fair, or was it just for the elite?
That is a very good question. I'm really like delving back into my files in my mind. And for some reason, 25 cents kind of pops up for me for a daily entry. I may be wrong about that, but what I will say is that the fair organizers, they had quite a bit of, they tried to bring in working classes by creating kind of special days where people who were members of unions would get a discounted rate of 10 cents. For some reason that pops into my head too. And so there were special days, right, that would allow people who couldn't afford the higher rate to have entry into the fair. And this was to ameliorate some labor tension, we'll say, that erupted in the construction of the Portland Fair. I couldn't tell you that. I know that there were 1.5 million people who came to the fair. Most of them were local. right? So I think it was popularly attended and accessible.
Could you put Swan Island into that picture? The Swan Island that we know now.
Could you help me with that? So,
What part of that picture up there, the map of the fairgrounds, is still remaining in our, what we call Swan Island?
maybe. No? Which image would be most helpful? This one? Okay.
Swan Island is on the east side, and this fair was on the west side. So Swan Island did not play a role in the fair.
Thank you.
You mentioned that one of the goals, one of the goals of the fair was to increase immigration to Portland. Who were they trying to get to immigrate, from where, and how did they go about recruiting people to come?
I'm not sure they had a specific ideal immigrant in mind, except that the records that I've seen of immigration offices in Washington State, they were trying to attract mostly Scandinavian workers, right? So they were looking for Western and Northern Europeans, but also people from the East who were bringing particular skills. There was always a need for labor in the lumber timber industry. So probably those folks, but I think they just needed bodies and homes, right? I don't know who exactly was attracted in that first wave afterward. I'm not that familiar with Portland history. And I would say the way that the fair hoped to do that was by inviting people during the dry season, right? And through the landscaping and orientation, right, to create this really kind of beautiful, but also manicured kind of fantasy land that made the Northwest not appear as a kind of backwater territory, but really as a very thriving cultural place on the West Coast already.
One and then two.
Do we know what happened to the people who were relocated in order to build the fair?
I looked and looked online. I can't find mention of who exactly was relocated. I'm assuming because there were about 40 Chinese tenant farmers there that they were relocated, but I don't know to where in the city they went. Yeah.
I'm interested in the relationship of power and culture, which is, it's striking the technological differences between the local culture, which was, call it appropriate, if you will, to the native area, and the imposed European culture, the vastly more complex transportation systems and so on, and attitudes which prevailed, I think, well, in my lifetime, to the 30s and the 40s, as the norm in this country. We were the great shining light of democracy. Our culture was obviously a model to the world and should be spread, et cetera, et cetera. To the more recent idea that cultures need to share with each other. To some extent, the technology of the times was building things. It was visible stuff, big, powerful engines. The dominant technology today is a communications technology. The internet, the fast interactions between cultures in trade and so on. Do you see any difference between the way people saw themselves in those days with the industrial culture and the way we are beginning to see each other today with our, what I would call a sharing communication technology?
That's something I had not thought about very much. Well, I think the definition of technology has expanded today, right? So we can kind of appreciate that there are systems of knowledge that that allow for kind of adaptations and new creations kind of in us already, right, in a way that I don't think was appreciated in the 19th century and at the turn of the century, right, that you needed to do these sort of external grand architectural engineering feats, right, and I think that that has changed a bit today, so that I think we're more open to adaptations, which means also different interpretations of technology, right, and how that can be expressed. So it's still, I think we still very much believe in the idea of progress. But just kind of speaking off the cuff, it seems like that technology itself is a bit more expansive than it was at the turn of the century. But that's just my immediate reaction. But it's a good thought and a good conversation to continue.
I think we have time for one more question.
I have somebody who
Okay.
has their hand raised right here.
I'm just wondering, why was it so common to make these beautiful structures temporary?
Because it was cheap. Yeah, it was only supposed to last for a summer. Really cheap to put up, plaster of Paris, there you go. Yeah, and it would make a lot of money for those few months.
Thank you, Lisa. If anybody has additional questions, I'm sure she will be happy to answer them.